Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We are pleased to have you here with us on this session here, the third in our series. This is going to be the introduction to profiling session. And as you're getting situated and a few more people are joining through the waiting room, we're going to cover a couple housekeeping items. My name is Pat Guerra. I'm the marketing director at HL7, and I wanted to thank you for joining us and then get things kicked off by letting you know if you have any technical difficulties during this session, please try logging out of the event app and then sign back in, and that should take care of it. If you still are having an issue, there is a DevDays support team option on Zulip, and that will get you the support you need. During the session, if you want to have a question posted, you can use the Q&A box, and our moderators will be answering those during the session. And then after the session, we will also have questions available to view as well. Regarding your video and microphone, please don't attempt to enable them unless the moderator or presenter prompts you to do so. Everyone has been muted by default. If you can't see or hear anything during the presentation, use that chat box and let us know. We do very much value your feedback. So after the session, please complete the survey that you will find in the app and let us know how your experience was, because we want to hear from you. And then lastly, just a quick announcement about the HL7 FHIR DevDays swag. You might be interested in checking out hl7.me/merch and commemorate your first experience with the virtual DevDays. The session is going to be recorded, so we are ready now to proceed with the introductions and recording of the session. Our presenter is Mirjam Baltus. She is a FHIR trainer and support engineer with FHIR, and she does provide FHIR and SNOMED CT training courses for architects and developers. She's responsible for the support of Forge for customers like the NHS. And here's a fun fact you likely do not know. I did not know this. Mirjam and Ewout Kramer were classmates at the informatics department of the VU University in Amsterdam. The moderator for this session will be Matthias van der Wielen. So with that, we are ready to get things started.
Hi all, so welcome. I will start right away by sharing my screen, and then this is the FHIR API for that .NET programmer session. So not the introduction to profiling, that will be done tomorrow actually, also by me. This is first the FHIR API. So we are going to take a closer look at the FHIR API and also hopefully get you up and running with creating a simple FHIR app, and then, well, you can start your FHIR work. So I'm Mirjam. As you can see, I work for FHIR, and FHIR is a company that can provide you with all the tooling, training, and software that you might need to set your FHIR alight. You can see that I have my setup there, and hopefully you can also see my nice background. My backdrop is a FHIR backdrop as well. If you want to review these slides, you can find them on the link that is on this particular slide, but you can also drop me a message later on in the Hoover app. I will monitor that for any questions you might have after this particular session if you didn't get around to asking it during the session. If you have more complicated questions, also please drop me a line in the Hoover app, and we could try and schedule a meeting outside of the regular sessions. Well, you might have heard the FHIR brand in combination with helping to organize this event, but we do a lot more than that. So you can see the FHIR ecosystem that we have here, and we will focus on this last part. So we will take a closer look at the FHIR API because, well, hopefully you're all developers. If you're not, still I hope you have an enjoyable session and at least get an idea of what is possible with FHIR. So what we are going to take a look at is the reference implementation for that .NET. It is maintained by FHIR, but it is an open source project. It's called the HL7.FHIR API, and we can find that on GitHub. The source code is on there. And of course, if you have your Visual Studio project running, you can download those libraries through NuGet. So that's the first step that you might want to do whenever you start out with creating a FHIR application. Just start any application type that you might like, and then you add one of the HL7 FHIR packages. So in this case, what we will do during this session is use the HL7 FHIR R4 package for release 4 of FHIR. There are also packages for the older versions of FHIR, plus a preview package for R5 if you want to. So this is the first step that we are going to do. As you can see, the links for these particular, for the source code is on there on this slide. And we also have a limited bit of documentation on our documentation site that's listed here to help you get started or help you, well, after this session, help you get further. The FHIR libraries will provide you with all of the models. So all of the classes that you know from the specification, all the FHIR resource types and data types, they will be in that model, and you will get them through downloading that library. There's also a FHIR client, so that's for the RESTful functionality, and we will take a look at that and create our own first FHIR client this session. There's other things as well, parsers and serializers and other nice helper functions. I will not cover them during this session, but as I said, if you have any questions afterwards, then please reach out to me and I will be able to help you further with that. So first of all, let's take a look at the FHIR model. If you are going to use that FHIR model, of course, within your code, you will set a using statement that is on this slide, hl7.FHIR.model, after you have integrated the libraries into your project. This slide shows you an observation resource. So this is just a screenshot taken from the FHIR specification. And what you will see is whenever you look at the FHIR model in the libraries, you will be able to find all of these fields that we have, all of these names inside of our model in the class of the observation class in this case. So looking at those classes, you will see that observation is derived from this domain resource class there, which is the technical hierarchy that you can also find in the FHIR specification. The domain resource makes it possible for any other resource type to have extensions on them, to have contained resources and a couple of other fields. So you will get them from that domain resource type there. Within our classes, we can see for every field that you have, you will see a field there as well. So take a look at this status field. It is of type code there, and you will be able to find that status field inside of observation as well. Now you can see that we have an observation status here, and it says required. This means that this field has to be filled with a code from that observation status list. There are a couple of possibilities listed on the documentation in the specification already, so you can see registered, preliminary, but there are more than those. Whenever you see a fixed list of codes like that, the FHIR library offers you an enumeration, and then you can fill your code with that particular enumeration. So you can see we have a public enum here with these statuses, with all of them, of course, inside of there. And then to fill that observation status, we can do it like this. So first, of course, we need to create a new object, an in-memory observation. So that's the first line of code here. And then we can fill that observation status with one of the statuses available to you. That way you will not make a mistake in creating the value for that code. Since it's a fixed list, we can do that whenever it doesn't say required at the end of that list. So it does say it here, but if it doesn't say required, then there will not be a corresponding enumeration, because then the list is not fixed, and there could be the possibility at least to have other codes added to that particular field. So this is the first thing that we could try and do. And of course, since this field is also a mandatory field, you will have to fill in a status when you are going to create the data in this particular object. Now, for each of the FHIR data types, you will also see a corresponding data type in the FHIR specification. So in this case, we are looking at the codable concept, which is a more complex data type, a grouping of data inside of the FHIR specification. So that codable concept type contains other fields as well. It contains subfields in there. For each of those data types, of course, you will see that there is a class in the FHIR libraries for you. So in this case, we can see that the code field within the observation is of type codable concept, and then we can fill this in with the particular things that you can fill a codable concept with. Well, a codable concept combines the system value with the value of the code itself, and you can also set a display value. And you can see a notation here where we already have a constructor that can hold these particular parts. So it takes the system part, it takes the value, and it takes the display as well. So that's an easy way to be able to fill in a codable concept. If you would look closer at codable concept, then you will see that there are 0 to star codings inside. So what this particular bit of code will do is create one coding and then fill my codable concept with this system and value inside of that coding. So the resulting XML or JSON will look a little bit more complicated than what you will see on my screen at this time. Whenever you find that there is a 0 to star or 1 to star list in the FHIR specification, you will be able to see that we use the list as well, and that list is just the .NET list that is available. And of course, well, we use the data type that we need to have in FHIR to be able to set that particular identifier or add to that list. So in this case, what we could do is reach out to the observation identifier and then just say add this particular new identifier that I'm creating. Again, for the identifier data type, we have a constructor that takes the naming system and the value together in order to create a nice identifier out of that. What you can see here is that if I just fill in this code, this will work. It will not generate an error. When you have a list like this, you will not need to check whether that list is null and then create it. That will be done by the library for you. So you can just add to any of the fields that are a list type field. Now, if you look in the FHIR specification, you can find these parts that say backbone element. So in this case, we see component, which is a part of the observation that we were looking at. And it says that the component is a backbone element. Actually, that backbone element just means that this is a grouping of information. So the component itself does not take any value. It will have subfields that can take values. Whenever you see a construction like that in the FHIR specification, you will see that we have an extra class added to the FHIR library. So in this case, you can see we have this component. It sounds a bit duplicate actually in this case, but that's because we always take the field name, which in this case is component. So that's the first one. And then we add component to it to indicate that this is a sub-part, a sub-block of information within the main resource. In observation, for example, you also have reference range, and that component will be called reference range component. But yeah, I took this example to show you that you can encounter these, well, a little bit of elaborate names there. Whenever you need to fill the data inside such a component, you will of course need to create that particular component first. So we are going to create a new observation.component component, and then we can use that to fill the values inside of there. After that, we will have to add that component to our object, to our main observation object in this case. So you can see that I add this to the list in here. Observation, we add to the component field this component that I've just created. This add, of course, is because we have a list, a 0 to star list of components inside of this particular observation. So we can fill the data inside. One of the things that you can find inside of that component is something called a choice property. You can encounter those choice properties all over in the specification. You will see a field name and then an X attached to them. That's a choice property. Such a choice property can take a list of values, or actually it can take one value, but you have to make a choice out of the list of possible values that you have there. And you can see that the name of the field in the FHIR specification, and also if you look at JSON or XML, will be, for example, value quantity if you choose the quantity data type, or value string if you use the string data type. In our code, we still need to fill in that value field. So you will encounter that value in the code, and it is of type element. This might surprise you when you see this first, so that's why I have this slide about that. That element is the base data type in FHIR. All of the data types are derived from element. So because the FHIR library does not know what kind of value you are going to choose, and we have to cater to every possibility there, we can only say that this value field is of type element. And then what you need to do in code is make that choice and fill my value with a FHIR data type. So here's an example to do that. First, what I'm doing is creating a new quantity, which is one of the FHIR data types. I fill all of the values that I have, and then I can add that quantity to my value field. So you will have to first create something of a FHIR data type in order to be able to add that to that particular choice property that is in that object, in that resource. Then we looked at that status field, but if you take a closer look in the code and you are going to use auto-completion, what you will be able to see is that for some of these fields, you will have two similar things in there. So for example, this is of type code. This is a primitive type, as we call it in FHIR, because it takes a value directly. It does not have subfields with values, in contrast to the complex data type that FHIR has. So this primitive data type can take a value, and wherever you see a primitive type being used in one of the fields, in the library, you will see two things. So for example, first, you will see the status field itself. That can take that observation status. But this is the .NET way of adding data to that field. It's relatively easy. You just fill in that observation status with the code that you want to have in there. But what you can also find is that observation has something called status element. So that's this one, the second one. This one does not have a .NET native type, but it uses one of the FHIR data types. So in this case, that's the code data type of FHIR. If you then look at filling in that status element instead of status, you will have to do that with a FHIR type, just like you would do with that choice property, creating a new FHIR type and then filling that with data. That's the same that we do in this case for that status element. In the end, it will work on the same part in memory. So if you set the normal observation.status with the .NET way, then that will fill the same in-memory part as when you fill in that status element. And of course, if you look at my code, that second line looks a lot more complicated. So now you might have a question, why would we use that second part? Why would we use that element instead of using just observation status? Well, in order to hopefully explain that a little bit more, I'm not going to look at the observation anymore. We jump to the FHIR patient in this case. The FHIR patient has a name, and that name is of type human name. Now, if we look at the given part of that, that's a list of strings. So we can fill it like that first example there. We could also do the second option where we fill in that given element, where we have a list and we have to fill in with a FHIR data type. So in this case, that would be the FHIR string. Now, my last name is on this slide as well, and it consists of two parts. That's my husband's name and my maiden name together. So that's my, my complete name. But if I want to separate out those parts, we can use extensions. You have heard of extensions in FHIR, I hope, but what you cannot do is add an extension to one of the .NET native types, because a .NET string does not know about any extensions that could be on there. Whenever you need to put an extension on a primitive type, then you would use that element part of that. So in this case, we can add an extension to given element, but we cannot add an extension to given. Well, sorry, this is family element, but that's the same thing. That's also a string. So what we do here is, if I want to add that particular extension, I use the element part of the class instead of just using family, because that would not work. So whenever, when you are coding, you run into the question of, it should be possible to add an extension on any element in FHIR. Why can't I add it here? Think about this. Think about whether you are working on a .NET type or whether you're working with a FHIR type. That's the equivalent of that particular .NET type. If it's the first one, you cannot add extensions to that. If it's the second one, you are able to add extensions. So that's where I use this usually. Okay, well, in my description of my session, I promised you that we would do some coding together. So that is what we are now going to do. So if you have the option to add or start up a Visual Studio environment, you can work with me here. What I have done is I have created a simple console app, which is usually easiest for, of course, for demoing. If you go to the NuGet platform, then of course you can add a NuGet package. So as I said, you will just have to search for hl7.FHIR, and then you will get a whole list of the possibilities there. Of course, I have already added my library. It's the R4 library, but you can see that we have the STU2. There's an R3 there as well, STU3, sorry, because it was still standard for trial use and not release. And if you have the pre-release shown, then you will also be able to find this hl7.FHIR.R5. But since that's still in preview, this library is a beta library, and it may still change before the final release has been done. So you can add your package to your project, and then of course we can start using this. Before I'm going to do that, I will switch over to my browser just to show you where we have that library. So in this case, it's on GitHub, as I said, and the link is in the slides. It's the FHIR team and then FHIR Net API. And you can see that there is a whole lot of information here. So you could browse through the source. Nice thing that I wanted to point out, and that's why I've opened this particular site, is that there are tests available as well. And if you are stuck in your code, it's sometimes useful to just browse through the tests and see what is possible on the FHIR libraries. So that could be really useful to just check out and see if there's anything in the tests that can help you progress with your own application. Okay, so now switching back to my Visual Studio there, we are going to use the model. So I'm going to say using hl7.fhir.model. And if you have your Visual Studio open and if you have put that library on there as well, you can do this together with me. So now I have my model, and now that means that I can create a new observation, right? Just like in my slides, I could just do this observation. What is going to be a new observation? So that's the first step. And now I need to fill in that observation status because that is a mandatory field. That is not visible, by the way, in the library. So this is something that you will need to know about. Well, as you can see, we have both status and status element. If I'm not doing anything fancy, I'm just using the normal field without the element attached to the name. So I'm just going to use status in this case. And then I'm going to fill this in with the observation status that I want. So, well, let's make that preliminary, just like in my slides. And as you can see, IntelliSense helps you there to fill this in correctly. Now, of course, you do know where to find that observation, right? Or if you're new to FHIR, well, I have it open in my browser as well. Just be sure to, whenever you create data like this, to check all of the cardinalities in the resource type that you need. So in this case, I knew that the status field was a mandatory one, but you can see that we also have to fill in a code. So that's the next thing that we need to do. So let me just go and do that. So observation.code needs to be filled in. If you don't type it in correctly, as you can see, that will not help you that much. So I know that that is of type codable concept. Again, that is in the FHIR specification. So we can fill this in with a new codable concept. And codable concept consists of 0 to star codings, but I usually, when I do this first thing, I usually just use the first constructor there that, well, the one that helps me with filling in a system and a code. So let's make that just http example.org. And then, well, something like that. And then just some kind of a value, example 1, 2, 3. I can also fill in a display value. Of course, if you have it, then that would be really useful because that could be used as fallback mechanism whenever a system receiving this data does not know the code. Well, let's just make it short and do this. Okay, so now we have a code filled in. And usually when you do an observation, you of course also want to fill in a value there. So let me just create a new value. Like in the slides, let's make a quantity. And of course, you can fill it in right away, or you can use just regular options there. Since it's a complex data type, it will have subfields. So what we will have to fill in is code. And we fill in a value, of course. Let's see. In the units. So we have a couple of things there, and you can copy this from the slide deck if you wanted to. Sorry, that has to be a decimal, of course. Okay, so now we have that quantity. Now we can fill in that observation value. So you can see that if I do observation value, it is of type element. So hover over it, you can see it's of type element, and it will take any FHIR type that you would have. So in this case, that would be my quantity. What I didn't explain during my presentation is whenever you have a FHIR data type that is this primitive data type, but it also has its counterpart in .NET, like for example, a string, then usually, of course, you would use the normal .NET string to fill in the values. But if you do need that particular FHIR data type, then it will be FHIR string. So there will be the word FHIR in front of the name in order to not have any conflicts with the existing .NET type. When there are no conflicts, then you can see just the FHIR name instead. But for any things that might have a conflict, it is FHIR and then the name of the data type. Okay, so we have these parts attached to my observation there. And now I have, well, an observation object. I can fill in other things as well. So I could copy that code from that component and then add a component part to it, etc. So those are all of the fields are available and you can just use them. So that's the model, and you will be able to use that. You don't need to worry about any of the things in the FHIR specification because all of the resource and data types are in the model for you already. So that's the first part. So I already see that there are a couple of questions there. So thank you, Marco, for answering some of them. Well, I will be going over them after I did this last part, and then we will see how much time we will have left for other things there as well. So in this case, of course, we can fill in that object. What I've done now is just do it by hand, but of course you could imagine that you already have a database that is in your backend system and that you can take the data from there and then fill your object with the data in inside of, put the data inside of the FHIR object. After you have correctly filled that object, you might want to communicate that. And this is where the RESTful part of the FHIR libraries come into play. So you can see that we have a using statement again here, where we use FHIR.REST in order to have access to the FHIR client. Trying this out can be done against any of the publicly available FHIR servers. Well, if you just Google publicly available servers, FHIR servers, then you will get to the wiki page that holds them. What we are going to do here is use the vonk.fhir.ly server, which is the FHIR implementation of a FHIR server. And as you can see, we use the R4 endpoint because we use the R4 libraries as well. So this is just creating a FHIR client. You could set any options on there if it's important to you. So you could say something like, well, I prefer to get back XML, or whenever I create something, I want you to send, or the server to send me back the representation of the resource as well. So there's a couple of options that you can use to tailor that client to your needs. Usually starting out with the default option is enough, but well, if you find that you need extras, then just take a look at the options you have. Of course, this statement does not reach out to the server yet. This is just the creation in memory of that client object. If we want to use it, we have to instruct that client to do something. So in this case, again, we have created that observation, filled in some of the fields that, for example, of course, the mandatory fields, but any other fields that you have. And now we want to send this to the server. We do that with the client.create interaction. You will have to specify what resource type you are going to send, because that will be put on the URL, of course. And then, of course, you also supply this with the object that you want to send. So this should result in something, but please note that, of course, the server could send back an error. And if the client does not get back an observation, but it receives an error code, then this will generate an error as well. So you would have to do some exception handling there around such statements. Usually in demos, I do not do that, but that will also result in crashes sometimes of my code. So that's something that you could encounter.
That's 5 minutes left, Mirjam.
Okay, thank you. So there's other options there as well. You can also request data, or you can update data if you have with these statements. And of course, you can also use the delete statement. So any of the FHIR interactions that you might want to do, they are available in the client as well. Well, let me just walk quickly through this bundles and searches one. That's just 2 slides left, and then we will see about the questions. So one of the things that next to the create, read, update, delete interactions that you want to do would be creating a search, a query to the FHIR server. What you will have to do is set up your search params object. This is not a FHIR resource type. This is an object that the FHIR library uses to create searches. We could fill them with fluent notation like this, but you can also just use things like add and then add key value pairs for your search. So this would result in a very complex search statement on the URL. Then when you want to perform the search, you will have to do a client.search. Again, supply the resource that you want to do searches on and supply this with your particular search params object. It will result in a bundle if you haven't put in any errors. So that will then be a bundle object, and you can walk through that bundle in order to get the result entries out of there, which are then, of course, the FHIR objects. And well, if the server sends back any paged results, this is a bit of code to help you walk through all of the pages if you want to, in this case, just in the forward direction. But of course, the bundle will also have a previous link, etc. And the client can work with that as well. So that was the last part of this. And this could be done in code as well. So let me just quickly check. We don't have that much time anymore, but of course you would just fill in using statement here. Rest. And then of course, after this, we can create this FHIR client object and then use that. Well, if you have downloaded my slides, then that code will be in there, and you can just copy that code and, well, try it out. Oh, that should be new, but okay. Let me see if there are any questions that need answering. So Marco has already done. Okay, so doing new observation component is only creating component or also creating the observation? Well, that is a good question, but it only creates that particular component. So you will also still need to do this new observation one and then add that component to the field that, that can take that particular component there. So that would be that answer. So another question for choice properties, it's up to the dev to choose the right element. Does anything nasty happen if we were to choose one unsupported by the spec? Well, of course, it has to be one of the FHIR types. So you cannot just put anything else in. If I just had a .NET string, it would not work to fill my choice property with that .NET string. I can fill it with a FHIR string, and the specification or the library does not check all of the choices that are available to you. So it will be up to you to fill it with a correct one according to the list of choices that you would have. Of course, something nasty can happen whenever you then send it out to a server, and that server will validate your code or your resource, your data. It can send back an error. and of course yourselves as well. In the library there are options to be able to validate your data, so that's a bit more advanced than we have time for here, but that will also throw a validation error, so that's a good thing to always check. Run the resulting data through a validator just to see whether you have created the correct observation or correct FHIR resource data out of that.
And Mirjam, I do apologize. We are at time here.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you very much, and thank you all for attending. Please do note that if there were any unanswered questions in the Whova app, they will be persistent. So Mirjam and the moderator will be looking at those, and we'll make sure they get answered. And please check the agenda in the Whova app to get to your next meeting.
Okay, well, thank you for attending, and drop me a message if you have any more questions.
All right, thank you, Mirjam.